My view of the Arab Spring was that it was, in a perverse sense, God's gift to Al-Qaeda, because it created exactly the sorts of circumstances, the sorts of conditions in which Al-Qaeda thrives. And those conditions arose in North Africa, really concomitant with the Arab Spring revolutions, and they were hastened, they were really accelerated by the invasion of Libya, by the overthrowing of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which created a fabulous space for Al-Qaeda types to establish themselves. And when the state is not in a position to maintain civic order, where law enforcement falters, where border controls dwindle, where they fade because of a lack of capacity, that provides an opening for groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda to gain a foothold, because they can do so without any kind of resistance from the state. There are no barriers. And you could see them flowing back into Libya as the Libyan revolution unfolded. And this was before things happened of the terrible kind as has happened in Syria. So it started there, and the lack of government capacity on the one hand, and the belief on the part of the new rulers that, well, Al-Qaeda was just going to die out. Those factors combined to enable the rise of Al-Qaeda. And then, with borders that were essentially not patrolled anymore or controlled, in any serious fashion, these guys could move back and forth. And with the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, colossal stocks of weapons were just, unleashed to the street. So anyway, I think, this kind of thing preceded the disasters in Syria and the problems that Iraq is now experiencing. The United States, I think, is particularly resistant, to learning lessons from hard-won experience. On the Iraq question, I think it's too early to say. I mean, but to be sure, the U.S. didn't really know what it was getting into in Iraq, and the leaders of Western countries, but particularly the UK and the US, had a conception, of Iraq that was very distorted and astonishingly oversimplified. The downturn in Iraqi politics is really a function of two things. The one is the war in Syria, which has had the effect of erasing the border between Iraq and Syria, a border that was already compromised by Assad's game, over the past few years when the war in Iraq was really going hot and heavy. His little game of sending jihadists, into Iraq. I mean, that's where it started. But regardless of how it all began, the Syrian war is a factor in Iraq's current problems. But it wouldn't be such a big deal, really, if Iraqi politics hadn't been handled in the way they have been by Nouri al-Maliki, whose disregard for Sunni equities has been striking, actually. So you have a situation where there's an external threat that matures because of the inept policies of the Iraqi government itself. Maliki, I think, could probably deal with this. I don't see this as a lethal threat to the viability of the Iraqi state. Maliki has a huge army. He's got over 900,000 soldiers. The U.S. is rushing weapons to Iraq, which are optimized for the purposes of destroying, Al-Qaeda type networks and killing insurgents. And no doubt the U.S. will work to acquire the intelligence necessary to enable the Iraqis to target these guys. So, I don't see things falling apart, but I do see things as getting pretty difficult and pretty awkward, for the Iraqi population. Now, the open question is what happens when Iraq's Shiite population decides that it's been victimized just a bit too much by Sunni violence, and you get a blowback or a broad impulse to retaliation that spreads through a good deal of Iraqi society, such that you get more ethnic cleansing than has already taken place and more bloodshed. That's a worrisome scenario, I suppose. But if I had to bet, I'd say that Iraq, pretty much holds together, even though it's going to be ugly. I mean, my sense is that the reticence you see on the administration's part towards intervention in the Middle East at this point is a reflection of that introspection or sort of reevaluation of what the U.S. had been doing in the Middle East for the 10 years after 9/11. For that 10-year period, as you just noted, intervention was just colossal. Who would ever have thought that the United States would have hundreds of thousands of soldiers deployed to the very heart of the Middle East for years? I mean, it's, to me, it was just an astonishing thought, let alone an astonishing sight. But as you have also pointed out, it was an enormous investment, an enormous cost that did not bear fruit. And in some respects, especially through the empowerment of Iran, ran counter to America's strategic interests at the end of the day. So when you see an administration, as one does now, that is reluctant to jump into things, you're seeing an administration that has looked back at these policies that you've just described and thought, well, maybe it's time for a little more humility. I think basically everyone wants Assad out. And in part because he's become a repellent, figure to Americans. If he hadn't been repellent before the August 21st use of chemical weapons at Ghouta, then, he is after that. He's really become untouchable. But there's a practical issue at work as well, namely that there isn't anyone in a very disparate and very diverse opposition who's willing to sign a deal that leaves Assad in place. You won't find anyone in the opposition who will agree to that. So if there's going to be some kind of negotiated arrangement, it's going to have to entail Assad's departure. So, for moral and practical sort of diplomatic reasons, I don't think you'd find any responsible Americans, kind of winking and nodding that, well, maybe, Assad should stay there and fight terrorists or something. And there is, of course, the fact that the United States has a lot of practice fighting terrorists. We've been doing it now for 10 years, fairly intensively, particularly in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also in places like Yemen. So I don't think that there's a sense in Washington that somehow we need Assad to help us kill terrorists. When it comes to killing terrorists, the United States is pretty accomplished. And even at a more strategic level in the terrorism sphere, I mean, I think there's a strong feeling that Assad is, if anything, a lightning rod for terrorists. And that is, as long as he's there, terrorists will continue to be created, just come out of the woodwork and flock to Syria. So in a way, from an American perspective, the most efficient way to deal with the emerging terrorism problem is for Assad to disappear. The opposition will remain too fragmented. And the regime has proven to be remarkably cohesive. I mean, they do have their backs to the wall. And they have strong allies that, in the case of Iran and Hezbollah, have been willing to pay, you know, a high price to back the regime. And then they've got the Russians who are in a position to block anything that might happen in the Security Council. So here you have a recipe for continued conflict. And to the extent that the Saudis and to a lesser extent the Qataris pump weapons, you know, into Syria and kind of keep the opposition ticking over, that too will contribute to a longer catastrophe, a more comprehensive catastrophe. So when you say, well, will a coalition government, you know, make Syrian territory difficult to control or continue to provide a very hospitable location for jihadists and so forth, I have to say, well, you know, if we get to a point where there's a coalition government, then we'll worry about that. But I do think that if we do get some kind of resolution, you know, political resolution in Syria, that Western involvement in Syria to try and put the pieces back together again and render Syria, or help Syrians create, you know, a functioning state in which they can govern their territory can be expected. I think there will be more of an effort. I think it was an extremely unwise thing for the interim government to do, because we know from looking at the experience of other countries where this sort of thing has happened that indiscriminate suppression of opposition groups, and when I say indiscriminate, I mean where fence sitters, where people who are moderates are swept up along with radicals, and law enforcement is extremely aggressive, policing is extremely aggressive, it becomes the rational choice for people who are moderates to pick up a gun, because you know they're going to come for you, and they're going to come for you no matter what. So when you do the sorts of things that the interim government has done toward the Muslim Brothers, you are essentially asking for a more violent opposition. And that will create a vicious cycle, because the opposition will become more moderate. They'll become, there will be more stringent and even more violent attempts to suppress people affiliated with the brothers and people caught up in an anti-terrorism campaign, and that in turn will create more violence. And you're talking about a situation now which is unlike the Egypt of, say, the 1980s, when there was this kind of a problem. But Egyptian society was not divided in the profound way it is now. And Egypt's borders weren't completely open in the way they are now. And whether you look to the west at Libya, or you looked at the east at Sinai, it's open. So the suppression, the indiscriminate suppression of the brothers was imprudent because it exposes Egyptian society to the risk of cross-border violence and deeper polarization that will make some kind of political reconciliation down the road much more difficult to achieve. Even if the borders become poorly policed and bad things cross the borders relatively easily, I think the borders will remain, just as national identities, I think, will remain fairly firm. I mean, for most Syrians, they are Syrians. They consider themselves to be Syrians, and they look at a map, the old map of Syria, you know, on a globe, and they say to themselves, well, that's my country, and I'm Syrian. Now, they may be disagreeing rather violently about who gets to control that country and who gets to determine the rules that regulate life in that country, but they all consider themselves to be Syrians. And same, I think, is largely true in Iraq. Certainly true in Egypt. I mean, one of the remarkable things about the post-revolutionary period in Egypt has been the resurgence of nationalism. You know, even on the Islamist side. I mean, the brothers were nationalists, you know, as well, and certainly the opposition to the brothers and the military, they've adopted a kind of hyper-nationalist language that one didn't really see in Egypt before. So I think in most of these countries, the questions of boundaries and identities will remain pretty firm, even as political arrangements in these countries are fiercely contested. You know, I'm an American, so, you know, the answer has to be more inclusive. That's my ideological posture, that's my cultural preference, you know, that's my upbringing, so that's going to be my instinctive response. Whether that's right, you know, for these countries themselves, of course, you know, is another story. I think stability and prosperity in Egypt would probably be better served by a more inclusive political system. You know, I think that's probably true on just straightforward, if I can use the word, secular grounds. I mean, just independent of my sort of preferences. I think in Egypt, if it was more pluralistic, the economy would be better served. There'd be more transparency.